No, it's a terrifying disaster. And what cost do you think to the United States? What
the latest estimates since 2001, spending, including the spending in Ukraine, all the military spending designed to support these interventions, conflicts, wars, whatever you want to call them, about $14 trillion. Now, that $14 trillion is largely debt financed. So then you have to move from the $14 trillion to where we stand now in national sovereign debt, which of course I know the economic luminaries think is meaningless. But you have 130 million workers, and you look at those figures and suddenly you realize that every adult male or woman in the United States who works for a living has a debt hanging over them of roughly $240,000 in order to deal with what the 14 trillion have added to the national sovereign debt. And this is part of the issue, that people are walking away from this war for good reasons. Look, the average American earns about $31,000 a year. That's it. The average American pays about $16,600 a year. Now, the people in Congress, this doesn't affect them, or in the Hill or inside the Beltway. We're talking about the real Americans who live out there, who are scratching out a living. Keep in mind that a person who works all his life and then tries to draw on Social Security can expect a monthly payment of probably $1,400, if they're lucky, $1,400. We hand every alleged asylum seeker, illegal migrant pouring in through the border in Texas or wherever else, we hand them, when they get there, $2,200. And we put them on that $2,200 diet from there on out per month. Yet somebody who works all his life, retires and draws Social Security, gets $1,400. The Afghans who were hanging on to the planes in Kabul trying to come to the United States, when they arrived, they received $2,200 a month. Now, if you can make sense out of this, please try, because I don't think most Americans can make sense out of this at all. And that's one of the reasons people have said, not because they know anything about Ukraine. Most Americans don't. If they knew anything about the history of Eastern Europe, they would all say, get out. Because the wars and the blood and the hatred that have been characterized to that part of the world for hundreds of years is something we can't sort out. We can't fix it. We shouldn't try to arbitrate it. We don't know anything about it. We shouldn't be in this, is the bottom line. I think Americans have figured that out. But now they're beginning to look at the numbers and the figures, and they say, what happened to consent by the governed? Instead, we have contempt for the governed. Whatever the governed want, they don't get. Who gets it? Well, the donors get what they want. You know, somebody was joking the other day and said, you know, Doug, if the donors were cannibals, they'd feed the American people to them. That's the attitude in Washington, D.C. What's the donor want? Give me more money. It's a catastrophe. It's the destruction of our whole republic. And I don't think people realize how far gone things are. A lot of Americans sense it. And I think we're on the path to some sort of national come to Jesus moment, where we're tired of being the contemptibles. We want to have a say in what our government does, and we really don't have it.
You mentioned the donors, and we just had a conversation with Vivek Ramaswamy running for president, Republican side. He's rich, and so he doesn't need big donors. But he has said publicly that he can't get money from any big-time Republican donor because his position on Ukraine is similar to yours. He doesn't buy the NBC News version of the Ukraine war. Why are donors on both sides so attached to a war that's clearly hurting the United States?
Well, first of all, you've got to go through and identify the donors. What's their background? Where did they come from? And why do they feel the way they do? I think there are more personal issues here than we realize with many of them. Secondly, you have to look at the monetary benefits to them. If they're it's not just being heavily invested in the defense industry. You've seen that report from the Oakland Institute, which talks about arable land in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. some of the richest, most fertile soil anywhere in the world. A friend of mine who's Ukrainian said all you have to do is take an old boot, stick it in the ground in Ukraine, come back in 6 months and something grows. The boot's transformed into something you can eat. He said, that's how fertile this is. So there are people that are interested in getting control of it, oligarchs. They call them oligarchs in Eastern Europe. I'm starting to think that we should talk about oligarchs in the West.
Well, of course.
Because they're also invested in this. They have an interest in it. So that's part of it. Then, of course, you have the advantages of people on the Hill. You have somebody like McConnell who says, we're so fortunate that we're doing so much damage to the Russians. This will set them back for 10 years. They've lost all this equipment. The Ukrainians have done a great job. Well, of course, all that's a lie. That's a blatant falsehood. And then he follows up by saying, and we're offloading equipment so that we can replenish with newer equipment. Well, unfortunately, the new equipment we're going to buy looks an awful lot like the old equipment. So you're not necessarily getting new top-of-the-line material. You're just getting new versions of what you've already got, which, of course, is what Congress wants. Unfortunately, that doesn't prepare you for a future war because your probable opponents are investing in very different capabilities from the ones that you have. And remember, again, all the things that we once monopolized, all the precision, all of that's lost now. Everybody has it. There's nothing that we can do that they cannot also do in Moscow, in Beijing, and probably in many other countries that we don't even know about yet. But of course, it all means money. You know, where does the money go? Does it go into the Defense Department? Sure. But then it's transferred over into industry. And industry then contributes money to PACs. And the PAC money goes where? Back to the Hill. So it's a wonderful sort of recycling machine where the wash is washed again and again. Now, what happens in Ukraine? Well, the equipment shows up. Some of the equipment reaches the troops. A lot of it is sold off, ends up in arms bazaars like Kosovo, or we see it now being used by the drug cartels. We saw somebody working for one of the major cartels that is also involved in human trafficking walking around with a Javelin missile. The whole kit. Well, where did that come from? Well, it came from Europe. Probably may have gone from Europe to Afghanistan, Europe to North Africa, Europe to the Balkans, and then over into the United States, south of the border.
I mean, you can't be the only person who spent your life as an Army officer who's reached these conclusions. Like, what are they thinking at the Pentagon? There have to be people who've come to the same positions.
Tucker, we have right now, I think, 43, could be 44. It's usually 43 or 44, 4-star generals and admirals. You have to think about that. We have a force of 1.1.
It seems like a lot.
Well, let me explain just how much it is. We have 1.12 million people in the armed forces. In other words, you add up all the armed services, that 1.12 million. In World War II, at the height of the war, end of 42, beginning of 43, when we had 12.2 million men under arms, we had 7 4-stars. 7 4-stars. I can tell you who they were. You had George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, Douglas MacArthur commanding in the Pacific, Eisenhower commanding in Great Britain and in the European theater, Hap Arnold for the Air Force. Unofficially, he was the vice chief, but he was effectively commanding the air forces. And then you had Leahy, who was in the White House, Admiral Leahy as the liaison officer. He was effectively the unofficial chairman of the Joint Chiefs for FDR. Then you had Nimitz and King. King was the CNO, and Nimitz commanded the Pacific. Now, somehow or another, with only 7 4-stars, we managed to survive the greatest, most destructive war in history, and fortunately end up on the quote-unquote winning side. Now we are blessed with 43 to 44 4-stars organized into multiple commands designed to blanket the globe with American military power and interest. I think it borders on lunacy, especially since we don't live in the world of 1920, 1945. This is the 21st century.